Hebrews. We're going to be in Hebrews chapter 11 this morning, and actually also chapter 12. But we're going to start at the end of chapter 11, and as we put an end, as sort of a finale, I'm calling this the faith finale to this series we've been in for a while now, called The Rest of the Story, and looking at Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith, as I was referring to in my prayer. Just this beautiful retelling of so many stories from the Old Testament. So as you turn over to Hebrews chapter 11, I just want to mention two things. First of all, there's still some tickets available for next Sunday's Korea dinner. The ladies who are raising funds, you see probably the little graphic on the wall. It's amazing. You guys have been so generous in supporting what they're doing, and they're doing really well, raising funds and the Overflow campaign, all those things. Just want to, again, just thank you guys for your generosity and the ways that you support what God is doing here. But anyway, that dinner's next Sunday. There are tickets in the hallway for that and all that information. The other thing is, I'm not sure if this made it in the bulletin or not, but we have the opportunity to celebrate ordination service for Patrick Fox next month. So he passed his ordination exams and all of that stuff the end of last year, and so on January 19th at 6 p.m., we're going to be hosting an ordination service here, and it really kind of looks just like a church service, but we're celebrating what the Lord's doing in Patrick's life, and so whether you know Pat or not, make sure you come out for that. We'd love to see you there to support and celebrate what the Lord's been doing. So we're in, as I said, Hebrews 11, looking at the rest of the story, and each week we've launched into our discussion by reading these first few verses from Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11:1 says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen is not made out of things that are visible." And we've talked again and again and again about this theme of faith and the idea that faith is all about seen versus unseen, visible versus invisible. And how again and again in the Old Testament, the characters in the stories had to make a choice to do what made sense according to earthly logic, according to what could be seen, or to trust a God they couldn't see, about how things were in an unseen realm. And so that idea of things not seen, that idea that we trust that God created the world so that what is seen is not made out of the things that are visible, all sets the tone for that. And so each week we've looked at different characters from the story. We've talked about, it starts with Abel and continues with Abraham. And then we talked for a while about Abraham. We talked about Moses. And all these characters from the Bible that have one thing in common, and it's faith. The thing they don't have in common is perfection. Right, each one of these guys from the Old Testament stories, in fact, the Bible kind of goes out of its way to tell all of the stories and all the ways that they messed up, the ways they missed the mark. But the thing that held the story together, in accordance with the rest of the story that the author of Hebrews is trying to tell us, is that the thing that gave them power, the thing that made God move through them, was this thing called faith. And so, in chapter 11, verse 32, we have a situation where the author of Hebrews is in preacher mode, and he realizes he's run out of time. He's run out of your attention. And this happens if you've ever done if you're a teacher, if you've ever taught, you know, when you're losing the room, right? When everybody's eyes is glazing over. And the author of Hebrews can just sense that he's run out of time to discuss anything else in detail. And so now he's going to jump into summary mode. And so verse 32 begins this little summary mode where he just lists a bunch of things that happened and then lands the plane. So we get to watch him as he lands the plane this morning and gives us, finally, a really clear, so what? Right? So what does this mean for me and for my life? So that's what we're going to read here in these verses. It says in verse 32, "And what more shall I say? I've run out of time," he says. "For time would fail me," he says, to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and of goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their, what's the word? Faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. Therefore, this is chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. May God bless the reading of his word. I can hardly imagine a more perfect passage for us to reflect on as we conclude a year together in the scriptures, right? As there's a clarity to the crescendo here that we've been building to something, and now it's here, the point. And it grabs our attention. It's got the feelings of a coach's halftime speech, right? Here at the end. It's got this feeling of that general looking at his troops before the battle, right? That and the monologue that he might give. He's surveying us weary and frightened soldiers living the life of faith, struggling. He shows us the victories of the past, right? He says this is what God has done in the past. And then he brings us into the story. Now, here's the thing. We are not the story. But we are part of God's story. We have been given by God the dignity of a part to play in a grand drama that has been unfolding since creation. God's great rescue story. He's given us a part to play. And that's what I love about this. So he says, look at all of these things that have happened, and he uses this middle paragraph or this last paragraph of chapter 11 to say, and so this matters what you do. This matters how you live. This matters how you choose to run this race, because there's people who have come before you, and you stand on their shoulders. You received a gift because of their faith. And it's your turn to run with the baton. 2025 for me is feeling a lot like a year of it's my turn to run with the baton. I don't know why that is, why God has chosen out this year to be this year of so many things and so many transitions and so many things going on. But I don't know about you, but I've always been a sucker for New Year's. I have been since I was a kid. There's something about the idea of a fresh start. It's for the same reason I like a new school year, you know? It's like I can kind of brush the cobwebs off of life and start fresh. And so as we do that collectively here this week, As we close the chapter of 2024 with all of its frustrations and all of its failures, all of its blessings and all of its victories, as we open a new year, let us consider this morning how the lessons of this sort of finale of faith should move us to action. And so we're going to do the same thing we've done every week. Nothing new here. Three ideas, three truths or three lessons from the faith finale, what I'm calling these last verses. The first lesson is this, that faith brings power through the strength that God supplies. Faith brings power. That would be a short way of saying it. Probably should have kept it at that, more memorable. Faith brings power. But what power? Power to get through, to run through the linebacker? It's like power to run your car. No, power, spiritual power. Through the strength that God supplies. Let's look again at verse 32. Verse 32 through 34 is my first little section here, 32 through 34. He says, and what more shall I say, for time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. And we just can see, the male mind just sees pyrotechnics and a guitar solo. Look at these guys and what they did, right? And it's this classic moment where he's doing the same thing he did. He's name-dropping. He's name-dropping characters, not just characters, real men, but characters from these stories that these people have learned since they were little kids, And so whatever world you lived in, whatever TV you grew up on, he's going back to that thing that they understood more than anything else. Then it was these stories from the scriptures of men of old, men like Gideon. Yeah, we like Gideon. Because he took out all those bad guys, right? And we like Barak. We can't remember what he did, but pretty sure it was important. And, and Samson, yeah, he had muscles, He gives three different categories of people, three different offices of people from Israel's history. He talks about 4 judges. He talks about a king, and he talks about Samuel and the prophets. Samuel really kind of being the first of this office of prophets. And so those 3, for them, were they understood who these people were, where they fit in the story. But for our study this morning, I want us to just have a quick reminder, right? That first of all, the judges who were the ones who were named were Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah. These were men given leadership and authority over the people of Israel before the establishment of the monarchy. And the time of the judges was really and truly a Wild West era in Israel's history. The people are described in Judges as doing what was right in their own eyes. Another way to say that is lawlessness. And so these guys were the sheriff in town, right? And they were the ones who were supposed to represent God, enforce justice, keep the peace. Didn't always go very well. But interestingly enough, God picks out some of these guys and says, hey, the great things that Gideon did, the great things that Samson did, it was actually their faith. It was faith that God used to move things. Each judge brought his own flaws, right, and sins to the table. But time and time again, God moved in spite of, it was great that Samson was strong, but man, was he dumb. You can't read Samson's story and not be like, what was God thinking? Because this guy doesn't think at all. And you have Gideon. Gideon is this great war hero, except for when God goes to recruit him, he's hiding in a ditch. So God specifically uses these guys to say, yes, they did amazing things, but it wasn't because of how great they were. We wouldn't have elected any of them. But here they were, and God still used them. David is the next one, right? He's the only named his reign is largely considered, the high point of Israel's history, especially as remembered in the Old Testament. Either that or his son Solomon, right? It's kind of like a close second. And he's described in the scriptures as a man after God's own heart. And he's this warrior poet, and he's this kind of guy. He's like got all of the things that the ladies are looking for, right? And he is 100% somebody. We would have elected David because he's very electable. After all, he killed Goliath and all that stuff, right? But all that's great, except for we know that he's a man after God's own heart until he's not, right? He's a man after God's own heart until we realize, he's got a whole unconfessed sin problem that turns into this giant, this huge fallout in his life that he never really recovers from. So he's a flawed character as well. Samson and the prophets were God's mouthpieces, right? During the entire time, Samuel marked the end of the era of the judges, and he's the one who began the monarchy under Saul and later David. He's described as a man who grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and men. If that sounds familiar, that's because that was a quote from Luke 2 that describes Jesus. So Samuel was put forth as sort of this precursor to Jesus in the story. Yet he and the rest of the prophets were not generally popular, right? These were guys who suffered a lot because, turns out, speaking God's truth in love creates tension. And these men bore on their bodies and their spirits the scars of rejection, abuse, persecution even, for representing God. So what ties these three groups together? I would summarize it by the line in verse 34. They did all this cool stuff, right? Pyrotechnics, swords, helicopters, armies running away. This amazing stuff, right? Shut the mouths of lions, it says, I think. Yeah. But it's this line. Escaped the edge of the sword. They were made strong out of weakness. The thing that ties them all together is that they were made strong out of weakness. The faith brings power, right? Through the strength that God supplies. What gave each of these men the ability to do all the things that were named? Is it because they're the Old Testament greatest hits and they are just the fittest, the wisest, the bravest, the strongest? No, every single one of them was weak and flawed, right? Gideon hid from God. Samson was strong but dumb. David was a man after God's own heart but had a serious lust problem. The only thing that gave them strength wasn't a thing at all, right? It was God. God moved. God gave them strength. And he did it in the moments of their life when they were walking in faith. That's the thing that the author of Hebrews is reminding us. The thing, when they heard from God and responded in obedience, that's when God moved. When they heard from God and they responded in obedience, that's when God moved. Moved mountains, right? Defeated armies. Did things that were impossible because they had faith. There's a famous verse, right? This is one of those like football verses. Philippians 4, 11, 12, and 13. We only ever talk about 13. This is a verse I go over with my son almost every night. I can do all things through him who gives me strength, right? But look at what Paul says before he says that. He says, I have learned in whatever situation I am to be, what's the word? Content. Okay, we're talking about contentment here. He says, I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound in any and every circumstance. I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance, and need. He says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. The power of God sometimes moves mountains, right? We talked last week about the sea, the Red Sea being split. We see God move in miraculous ways in like whole nations being converted in a generation, and like God still moves in these miraculous mountain-moving ways. But way more often, the power of God is in the secret things. It's in the secret place. It's in our heart. It's in our minds. It's changing us from the inside out, from fleshly and spiritually dead people to people who are full of life. We see things from his perspective. We rejoice in trials. We pray for the persecuted and our persecutors. We give up what the earth has to offer for an eternal kingdom. Those are the mountains that faith move, right, in our hearts. And they're not these external things so often. So I ask a question, and it's kind of a dumb question. But are you tired? It's the end of Christmas. So yes, it's a dumb question. We're all tired. I don't just mean tired in the sense of, oh man, it's been a crazy week. Being tired is normal. The Bible says even youths grow weak and weary, right? We get tired. But a constant state of spiritual exhaustion is a symptom of a life that lacks faith. Because faith brings power through the strength that God supplies. And if that's you this morning, here's the good news. We can call upon the Lord, and it says he's going to give us strength. Especially if our aim, if our goal is to follow after him. He's the only one with the strength to deliver us, to restore us, to heal us. So that's my first lesson. The second lesson is going to be from the section that ends chapter 11. It's going to be about how faith leads to a life lived for eternity. He says in verse 35, he goes on with his list. He says, women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. 36, others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in sheep's skins and goats' skins, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. This section is one of the most beautiful sections, in my opinion, of the whole New Testament, because it's a paragraph that honors the faith of countless unnamed men and women throughout history who don't get a name in the story. They're not Abel, and they're not Abraham, and they're not Rahab. But they're real, and their stories mattered to God enough that he puts this it's a beautiful, but it's also a horrifying, right, list of the ways that God's people have suffered under persecution and even martyrdom. It doesn't name anybody specifically, but we can make connections to different people in the story. But it helps us to make sense of the tragedy of martyrdom and the difficulty of persecution. It gives us a God-inspired teaching to know how to respond when someone gives their life for the cause of the gospel. That life was not wasted. That life was given in worship. He says it was an act of faith. The chapter, though, takes this turn here in verse 12, and you can notice it with me in verse 39, when it says, all of these, though commended through their faith. Who else was commended for their faith? Abraham, right? Down through the whole list. He says they were commended for their faith. The other language in Scripture is that because of their faith, it was credited to them as righteousness. Although that's true, he says he takes this turn, and now he starts to talk about, notice in verse 40, he says, since God had provided something better for us. They died, he says, and they didn't, by dying, they gave up the chance, or they lost the ability to see God's promises to come to fulfillment in their life. Just like Abraham, right, who never saw the promised land. Just like Moses, who never saw the promised land. These promises, they died, and
And they had to come to find later that that promise was ultimately going to be fulfilled in eternity, right? But that he makes this turn and he starts to talk about us. He says, since God has provided something better for us. First, he makes this observation that everyone who died in faith before the cross died not seeing the promise of restoration come to fulfillment.
They put their faith, and in some ways, this makes their faith even greater. I think that's one of the points that he's making here. He says, they didn't have the resurrection to look back on. They didn't have the cross to look back on. They didn't have the life of Jesus to look back on. They didn't have the incarnation to look back on. All they had was the Old Testament promises and a word from the Lord, and they responded in faith. What's faith? Trusting that God's truth is truth, even when they couldn't see it. And so their not seeing it was a lot more not seeing it than our not seeing it is, if we're comparing, right?
It's just because they didn't even have Jesus.
Building on that, he makes the case that we have something better than those Old Testament saints that gave their life had. We don't have to wonder how God's going to forgive. We know he forgave in Christ. We know that the only perfect sacrifice that Jesus made on our behalf makes us right before God, that we don't have to bring a sacrifice, that there's nothing we could do to add to what he did. He said it was finished.
We have faith in the same God, but our faith involves so much more sight than those who came before. So it follows, and this is where it turns into a bit of that halftime speech, right? So it follows that if their faith in the first covenant drove them to forsake everything for God, to give up their lives, to be tortured, and it says to refuse to be released so that they could inherit a better life. If the Old Testament promises drove them to that, how much more should we forsake everything for the cause of Christ? How much more responsibility, how much greater is the love that we can see, right? So faith leaves us no choice but to follow in the footsteps, right, of these who've gone before us, to live a life, live for eternity. Because it doesn't make any sense, right, to give up your life for a God that you can't see. It doesn't, according to human, right, logic. But in light of eternity, in light of what God has done, in light of what Christ has done for us, that's what it leads to. So finally, he makes the case. He says they had real skin and blood in the game, and there's this sense of like, y'all are struggling, and I know you're struggling, and I'm here to pump you up and point you to Jesus, but you haven't bled yet, he says. And there's that little like college or high school football coach in you, right? In this to say, hey, put a little strength behind your spine, because see what's come before you. Then he says, and this is where he really lands the plane on the halftime speech. He says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Another way to summarize this, I've put this last lesson up. Faith gives us the ability to endure. Faith gives us the ability to endure. But what I would also say is this, another summary is, we're being watched. We're being watched, so we should look to Jesus. We're being watched. That's not something I think about often enough. I shouldn't say regularly, but I maybe occasionally I will catch myself acting or doing something, saying something that I wouldn't want one of my boys to say or do. The problem is, my son James in particular right now is a little parrot, right? He doesn't know what words mean, but he likes to say new words, right? And so it's it's like one of those things. We are being watched. Whether it's the people in our life, whether it's God, right? Like God sees what it is that we say. He doesn't just see what we do, and it says that he knows our thoughts. So there's a crowd for our life. We get told these lies that we're alone, right? That we're alone with our thoughts, that we don't have. No, we're very much being watched. And here it talks about this cloud of witnesses, which seems to be referring to all the people that he just talked about, right? He says, since all these people have come before us, and some people struggle with this, some people like to try and explain it away and says, well, they're witnesses to faith, they're not witnesses of our lives, they're not really watching our lives, but it seems to indicate that just maybe Abraham and Moses, Peter and Paul, they're actually kind of paying attention to what's going on down here, right? And they're not omnipresent and omnipotent like God is, right? That's not how it works. But minimally, God is paying attention, right? And he paints this picture of this Olympic-style image, right? Look at the verses again. He says, "We're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, so let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely and run with endurance the race that is set before us." We know in the Greco-Roman world, right, the importance of sport. And to run a race in a stadium is like something that they would have had experience with, right? And so he gives this little like sports analogy. Sorry if you're not into that, but he gives this little sports analogy, and he says, It's like we're in the middle of the 5K. Has anybody ever been there, right? And it's really like the brain is screaming. Our bodies were made to run. I know most of us don't believe that, but God made our bodies for endurance effort. Our bodies are capable, some more than others, but our brains are all the same, right? And the brain is just constantly screaming, "Stop, you're going to die." Right? It's all over if you don't stop right now. And you're in the middle of that race. And he says, and it's like, he says, pay attention, this isn't a training run. Right? Some of you grew up in sports, in athletics. You spent a lot of time getting better at a game, at whatever it was that you did. And you guys know the difference, right, between a scrimmage or between practice and the game, right? When it's the game and mom and dad are watching, right? Maybe a girlfriend, boyfriend, the whole school, right? If you played high school football, maybe. You know what happens, right? Those Friday night lights turn on, and there's this fourth gear, this overdrive gear that you find, because this isn't just practice. This is the whole thing. That's why I put in all this work, why we did all this. And he paints this picture. He says, there is a great cloud of witnesses. And you're not in practice. This is the real thing. This is the battle. Pay attention. We're being watched. Every sense is heightened. The stakes are high. The pressures are on. And in faith, our response to being watched shouldn't be for us to dig deeper, try harder, right? There's only two things that the author of Hebrews encourages us to do. Since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, since it is game day, it's our turn with the baton. What are we supposed to do? He says, run unencumbered. Run unencumbered. He says, let us lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely. It's powerful, right? Obviously, running with sin is encumbering. But he says there are things that are not sin that are just weight, just distractions. Those things need to go too. You know, running is hard. We already talked about this, but running is hard. And we need as few distractions as possible. And that's why you see runners wearing minimal clothing, unencumbered clothing. There's a whole industry out there now, shoe companies trying to make a faster, more comfortable, lighter shoe. In ancient Rome, before the advent of spandex and all that stuff, Olympic runners were probably running around mostly just nude, right? That was the way. You don't get any lighter or freer than that, right? So with this in mind, right, running light in our minds, Hebrews makes the spiritual point. If you wouldn't run a foot race in jeans and a backpack, then why do we run the endurance race of faith full of distractions, entertaining sin, which could easily disqualify us? We should learn from the men of old, right? Who many of them did that. They had faith until they did, and then they paid the price. And on the days that God commends their faith, it was because they laid aside things like the comforts of Egypt in Moses' life. Abraham left behind the sure thing of his father's inheritance. Rahab risked it all to find the salvation of the Lord. They lived as if faith was an all-or-nothing venture, because that's what it is. And so this wisdom and insight looks like foolishness to our world-soaked minds, because we live in a great age of distraction. We're so used to distraction, we plan our lives around it, right? I'm gonna do this, and then I'm gonna sit on the couch and scroll Instagram, right? And we plan our whole day around our entertainment, our distractions, and the things that we put in our life to fill us with good feelings, with pleasure. And it's not that God's anti-pleasure, but he is anti-distraction. And he is saying there's a wisdom here that we have to lock in and see. Otherwise, our flesh will just run us, and we won't be living a life of faith. Because there's things in our life that are sin that we need to confess and repent of, and that needs to be done by the end of the day, right? And then there's a whole other list of things that's just weight, right? So we need to pray through that. As we enter into this new year, we need to ask, what's the weight? What are the things I'm bringing along? What are my equivalent, my spiritual equivalent of running in jeans and a backpack? Because that's just dumb. What are the things I need to lay behind? Because true freedom can only come when we live an unencumbered life in the life of faith. And it's equated to running, right? Which running is at the end of a race run well, what happens? There's a collapse. It's over. You've poured it all out on the field of play, right? Out on the track. It's worship to the one who gave it all for us. And that's what leads us to the other instruction given. Since we're being washed, since it's game day, we ought to look to who? Jesus, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of the faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despised the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. I was never much of an athlete as a younger kid. I know you can't believe that. But it's true. I was not much of an athlete. My parents were not really athletes. My dad ran track. My mom's got lots of great qualities, but athlete's just not one of them. And so I didn't have that T-ball experience as a kid. The closest thing I had was we got involved in AYSO football, which is sort of a very I'll call it non-competitive, right, soccer. AYSO is like what they do at the Y. Everybody gets to play. Everybody's treated equal. No, they're not really supposed to keep score, although everybody did. And it's just for fun, right? Which bothers all the really competitive people in the room. Are like, what's fun soccer if you're not keeping score, right? Soccer's already not fun even if you are keeping score. So anyway, I'm a soccer fan. What am I talking about?
But here's the thing. So we had this AYSO team I was a part of, and there was like that through the age groups. And it was like you did like 4 practices, and then there was like 8 games, and that was the whole season. And we were pretty garbage every year. Like, we were pretty bad. It was like all the unathletic kids that didn't play other sports, and then a coach that didn't really have any soccer background. And then what made it worse is that all the adjacent school districts had like school soccer. And their teams would use the AYSO season as like preseason. So they would kill us every time. It was like never even close. Like mercy ruled every time. Until one year we got this guy, I don't know where they found him, but he was this Scottish guy. And of course, if you know anything about Scotland, it's over in Europe apparently. And apparently in Europe, they like soccer. And it's not just a thing they do. It's like they're a one-sport place over there, right? We are divided over football, baseball, basketball. It's one thing. You got soccer, right? Maybe rugby, but soccer is life. And so this guy came in and he whipped us into shape. And I'll tell you what, morale was low on the team because we were learning things, but nobody wanted to. And we were running laps, and we never had to do that before. And it was really interesting. And so the lesson that I'll always remember from that coach was, other than the fact that I was out of shape, was to keep your head up. This is a novel idea to me. And I thought to myself, how am I supposed to keep my head up? I'm looking at the ball, trying to dribble the ball, right? So, but if you watch these professional soccer players, they're not looking at the ball. Their head is up. They're looking at the field, right? And this is a little bit, right? It's if you transfer that, my dumb story, like into the running world that the author of Hebrews is talking about. He's saying, look to Jesus. In other words, keep your head up, because this is a defeated runner, right? You see them at the end of the race, the middle of the race, right? You can't have good running form if your head is down. You can't survey the field of play if your head is down. You need to look up. You need to look to Jesus, because he's not just the example to follow, but he's the goal that you're after, right? Runners are looking at the horizon because the horizon is where they're headed. Soccer players need to have their head up because they need to be able to see how to get that ball into the goal. So that means they need to know where the ball's at just sort of instinctively and be that good, right? That they can see with that kind of vision. If we want to run the race of faith well, our eyes need to be up. We need to look to Jesus. Because he's not just the goal, he's the means to the goal. We're not going to make it on our own. We can't. Only if he empowers by his Holy Spirit can we endure to the end. But praise be to God, we have a promise that he will. If we just look up. We would be remiss, though, if in the last moments here we didn't talk about his example and consider it. After all, if we're his followers, we're going to live like he did. The verse says we should look to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. It gives us 2 things he did and 1 thing that resulted from it. What was the 2 things he did? He endured and he despised. Despised is a funny word. He endured the cross, right? It's not just that he was willing to be killed. It was that he was willing to endure an execution that took all morning and part of the afternoon. And the miracle of the cross is not just that Jesus spread his arms and let them put nails in his hands, but that he stayed up there with every ability to work a miracle and save himself. So if we're going to follow Jesus, we too must endure. It's the way he did it. It says the second thing is that he despised the shame. It's kind of a funny phrase, and I struggled reading this, thinking through this, meditating on it. What does it mean, despise the shame? David L. Allen, in his commentary, said this. He said, Jesus despised the shame in the sense that he willingly accepted his public crucifixion and did not let its suffering or its shame deter him from his goal.
He had his eyes up. He had his eyes up. And so it leads to the thing he earned, right? What was the thing that is the result of his endurance and of his despising the shame? He's seated at the right hand of the throne of God, it says. The work is done. He is on the victor's seat, having run the race. And all of that, but here's the thing. And so as we follow Jesus, we enter into his rest. We're also looking forward to a more perfect rest because we are in the middle of this race. But all of that skips past probably the most important line of the whole verse. For the joy set before him. Notice that? For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despised the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. The pain and the shame paled in comparison to the joy that was set before him. It was faith, ultimately, that led Jesus through the crucifixion. He trusted that what was coming was better than what he was in, and that this was the only way, because God said it was the only way, and so he did it, all the way to the end. And hear me, if we're struggling to endure, struggling to follow, if we lack strength in faith, it's because we've allowed our pain and our sin to become greater than the joy that is set before us. The joy that is set before us is Christ himself. He's the goal. He's the prize, the hope of glory, and it's the only thing that's going to bring us through.